So someone else that we're grateful for is our featured speaker tonight, David Gallus. David is a world-class reporter. If you haven't been following him in the New York Times, do it immediately today. He is a climate reporter at the New York Times and the lead for the Climate Forward newsletter at the New York Times. Before that, for 8 years, he was a business reporter for the New York Times, and before that, he worked with the Financial Times, reporting both in New York and San Francisco. We had the pleasure of meeting with David while we were over at COP28 in Dubai, which was such a joy, and we have also had a chance to see him in action interviewing at Climate Week, and so when he agreed to step in to the breach at the last minute, we thought we had just won the lottery. So, David, thank you so much for being with us. Please come on up.
Thank you so much for having me.
So one of the things we want to talk about is that not only are you a journalist, an award-winning journalist, you are also a bestseller, and you are about to launch a book in September on a very interesting CEO, the CEO of Patagonia, who actually made $1 billion and then in an incredible fashion gave it away.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about why his story resonated with you so much and why you wanted to bring it forward.
Yeah, well, thanks so much again for having me. I can't wait. There's so much to talk about, and I'm honored that we get to talk about a little preview of this book that's coming out on September 9th. It's called Dirtbag Billionaire, How Yvon Chouinard Built Patagonia, Made a Fortune, and Gave It All Away. And sort of the whole narrative, the whole arc of the story is embedded in that subtitle, because Yvon Chouinard really started as a dirtbag climber. He was first and foremost a rock climber who was just in love with the natural world. And this was long before we were talking about climate change in the way you just spoke about it, or long before Yvon and the rest of the Patagonia team were engaged in environmental activism. At his core, he was just someone that loved the natural world. And I related with that on a deep level because, like probably most people in this room, I also have a really deep connection with the natural world. I try to spend time outside. I try to get deep into the backcountry. I go on backcountry trips and try to get sort of as far away, frankly, from New York City as I can. And I think that innate connection with nature animates me, and we can talk about how it led me to my climate work, but it also animated Yvon Chouinard. When he built Patagonia then, he started making rock climbing equipment and then clothing equipment, and there was this moment where someone came to him and said, would you support this little environmental project I was doing? And in the same way you guys are on the ground doing grassroots conversations, this was a similar situation. Back in 1975, someone came to him and they said, we're trying to just stop development on the Ventura River in the backyard from where Patagonia's offices were. Will you help us? And he cut them a check. And that began this journey of environmental activism that then evolved in tandem with the business. So as the business got bigger, his environmental activism got bigger. And as he started learning more about what the supply chain was like and the environmental impacts of running an increasingly large company on a global marketplace, he started understanding that he had the opportunity to make an even bigger impact with environmental activism. Fast forward to several years ago, I'm at the New York Times and I'm covering business, and I realized that there's one company more than almost any other that's really going against the grain in the business world, and it's of course Patagonia. And they're doing things like suing the President of the United States when President Trump moved to roll back protections for some national monuments during his first term. Patagonia sued the president, right? Other companies are nervous to put out a tweet. This guy's filing lawsuits against the Department of the Interior. I looked a little deeper and oh my gosh, they're mobilizing other Fortune 500s to get out the vote. They're doing deep work to try to clean up not only their supply chain, but be really transparent when they find things like child labor in their own supply chain. They publicize it. And they say, this is unacceptable, but it's the status quo. And so already I could see 5-7 years ago, this is a really extraordinary company. And then 3 years ago, something really remarkable happened. I developed a relationship with Yvon over the years. I knew his team. And they came to me just under 3 years ago and they said, we've got a big news story coming out. Would you be interested in telling it? Well, when I figured out what the story was, the answer was absolutely yes. Because what he has done now, Yvon, as you said, was worth billions of dollars, not just $1 billion. The company was valued at $6 billion, and he and his family owned 100% of the equity. So this company was sitting on $6 billion in equity value on themselves for the corporation. They had offers on the table to sell it for $6 billion. No. And they said, we don't want the money. He didn't want the money. His wife didn't want the money. The money that they had been drawing as profits, distributions from the corporation all these years, they had been using to fund conservation efforts, to fund activism. Their kids didn't want the money. 2 children with their own children. They said, we don't want to inherit the company or the billions. And so they went through this estate planning exercise and came up with a really innovative solution. They created a new set of trusts and nonprofit entities, and they essentially gave the company away, locking up the equity so no one will ever realize the equity value of the corporation. It will never be sold. And instead what he said is we're going to mandate that 100% of the profits from this corporation, which is roughly $100 million a year, all of that money is spent down on an immediate basis for environmental causes and conservation. And at that point, I sort of had the full arc of a story. And I wrote that story. It was quite literally the most read piece of journalism I've ever written in my life. 13 million plus views. I mean, the story truly went viral. And after that story, I went back to Yvon and I said, I got to write a book about this. And he's sort of a curmudgeon, and so he told me not to at first. But I said I was going to do it anyway, and we wound up spending a lot of time together.
Wow, what an amazing man.
It's an amazing story.
Family.
Amazing family, amazing story. And it's been a real honor to be able to get close with them, get close with the company, spend time with them. I traveled with him in South America. We went on fishing trips. We went on road trips. I was at home with him cooking. And just to understand someone with such pure intentions and such a consistency in vision and values, I learned a lot myself from reporting this book, and I'm so excited to share it with the world.
Well, we'll be looking forward in September, and we actually have pre-orders of it if anyone wants to sign up for it at the end of this event. We have it.
Yeah.
So obviously he was kind of an out-of-the-box thinker. I wanted to focus a little bit on the economics. You were a financial writer, and to me, what I find resonates the most when we're on the road and surprises the most is how climate change will impact our economy and our financial stability going forward. I think it's kind of an undersung story, and yet it is potentially bigger than the crisis in 2008. It can be, in my opinion, I want to hear your opinion.
Yeah.
Why isn't it at the forefront at this time? And are the C-suites, all the other CEOs, aware of it and planning and thinking, or are they stymied because of the current situation?
Yeah, well, let's take it one question at a time.
Sorry.
The first thing I'd say is I absolutely concur that when you look at the long-term forecast, even the medium-term forecast, for how climate change is going to affect the economy, right? Let's set aside the natural systems in the natural world. We should have that conversation. But if we're just talking about the economy, I mean, I know there's people in this room who think about this deeply. And it's indisputable that it's going to have massive effects on the global economy, on local economies, on GDP. And we're already starting to see some of the impacts. And you referenced a few of the sort of the easiest to understand in your introductory remarks. Things like the price of coffee, the price of olive oil, right? When commodities are in shorter supply because of extreme weather that scientists can now document with attribution studies is being made worse by climate change, and that sends prices up, well, there's a pretty causal relationship that we can understand. But you zoom out a little further and you look at, say, the insurance market in California. And when large swaths of California or southern Florida are becoming uninsurable because insurance companies, which, let's be honest, are not ideological organizations. These are pretty hard-nosed companies that are motivated by their bottom lines. When they say it's not worth the risk to try to insure properties in large swaths of America because of the threat of rising sea levels, which we know are coming, because of the increase in wildfires, which is well documented now, and which we know are going to be more prevalent in the years ahead, well, there again, you see already. This is not something that's happening in the future. This is something that's happening now. There are real economic costs to climate change. And that's just what's happening now.
Right.
When you look a bit further afield, when you start projecting what's going to happen in 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, of course we can't know the details, but we do know that the scope and the magnitude is only going to get more intense. And you can start to extrapolate some of these big round numbers, and they're not in the billions, they're in the trillions, in the tens of trillions. And economists are talking about, major losses in global GDP. And again, hard to measure these kind of things. So we need to be careful not to be too precise with some of these projections, but the broad strokes are clear. It's gonna cost a lot of money, and this is critical. The longer we wait to act, the more expensive it gets. We were just talking about numbers, but behind all the numbers are people. And these are individual lives and stories and livelihoods and small businesses that are the ones that are going to be actually feeling the effects of all this. And I try to always keep that front of mind when I'm doing my reporting, right? It's one thing to talk about the big numbers, but behind each one of those numbers is a story about someone just like us, someone just like someone in this room who's going to have their life turned upside down by one of these events.
It's interesting you said that, because obviously a hot button around America right now is migration. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we talk about in our presentation is how migration from Central America and South America will be worse because their lands will be less habitable and will have that external pressure on. But something that many people haven't internalized is it's also expected that people from our own southern states will be moving north to get to more economically vital places mm-hmm. where their economies aren't as hammered, and just places that are cooler and not as exposed to some of these extreme storms. Mm-hmm. And so those that are railing against migration today may become the migrants of tomorrow.
Yeah.
And it's going to be within our country. And that's something that I don't think people have really internalized as well. But I think when you talk about individual lives, I don't want to say the frog's in the pot, because I recently learned that frogs jump out of the pot. They do not stay. I was like, but that people in some of these areas in the Deep South and even in the Midwest are kind of the first to feel these incredible impacts and are currently getting the most of FEMA dollars. And so it's so frustrating that the people that I think are going to be harmed first and foremost are the people that aren't getting the message.
Yeah. Well, and that's why the work you're all doing is so consequential. I do think there is an awareness gap, and we see that reflected in polling. We see that coursing through sort of the partisan politics that animate a civil discourse today, and it's it's deeply frustrating as a reporter to write stories where I every day in my inbox get people telling me, like the science is wrong, when of course it's well established at this point. As to the issue of sort of the regional variance of both the impacts and the awareness, I always try to recognize just how nuanced all of these things are. So I would note that there's plenty of people in Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, pick your southern state, that are deeply keyed into this issue and are working on the ground and finding solutions. I also think it's, I know that the broad strokes of migration, what you just described, make intuitive sense. But of course, if you look at the fastest growing areas in the country right now, it's the South, it's the Southwest, it's some of the hottest, and as you said, most vulnerable places. So some of the logical ways that we think things like migration might play out don't always necessarily comport with exactly how human nature and human behavior plays out at the end of the day, which again, makes my job continually interesting, because when you have the most people in the country moving to the hottest city in the country, in Phoenix, well, we got a good story there.
Yeah, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but there's a lot more to talk on that. But can we go back to the economics for a second, and when we were talking about CEOs, and I know I added that on to the last question, but I would be intrigued to hear what your impression is of what's being discussed in the C-suite, because 4 years ago, there was a lot of common language about we need to move forward, this is critically important for people and the economy. And now there are headwinds, and is it stopping action? Is it a slowing action? Are they continuing to do it but not talk about it? What are you seeing at the top echelons of business?
Well, you included an important distinction there, which is inside the C-suite. And I think what's happening inside the C-suite is very different than what C-suite leaders sometimes say publicly. And so there's no question that the public dialogue has changed markedly over certainly the last few months, but even the last couple of years. And there was this effort, which I reported on extensively, by really state-level Republicans to push back on ESG from Wall Street. And that definitely changed the dialogue. We were talking about green hushing earlier today. And so, yes, you saw especially major financial institutions, some of the other major corporations, calibrate some of their public remarks to stop talking about it so overtly. I don't think it's the case that if you get a CEO inside the C-suite, talking with their directors, talking with their executives, they are just as aware as they were 18 months ago that climate change poses some of these real systemic threats to their supply chains, to some of their facilities, to things like demand. So CEOs tend to be pretty grounded in the world of facts and figures. And again, when the science is this clear, they're not going to turn their back on that. What I would say is that if you think about sort of the years from the Paris Agreement 10 years ago until, call it 8 years ago, we were in a pretty healthy economic environment. And so what you saw was many of these companies made some of these aspirational climate commitments at a moment when both top line and bottom line were growing. And it was sort of easier to make add-on commitments and say, yeah, you know, it's good time, so sure, we're also going to help clean up the environment. That's when you saw the Business Roundtable put out this new statement on the purpose of a corporation, which again sort of tried to turn the page on the Milton Friedman shareholder primacy vision of the world and say, no, we care about people and planet and communities too. And what, of course, we've seen in the last several months is a much harder economic environment. And in that harder economic environment, I think it's much more challenging for CEOs to maintain some of these commitments, which at least some investors, some hedge fund investors, for example, might think would come at a cost. And I would also, just to pick on one industry in particular, note that many of the tech companies, which were leaders in this field, leaders in the effort to make really ambitious climate commitments, they all did that at a moment of essentially stable energy demand. And what we've seen in the last 18 months with the rise of AI and the growing demand for data centers is that companies like Microsoft and Facebook and Amazon and Google, they're all seeing, after years of relatively stable energy demand, it's a hockey stick going up for them. And I'll tell you what, even the most ambitious climate tech companies are not going to put their data center plans, their AI plans on hold because they can't power a new data center with solar power. If it means they're going to use gas, they're going to use gas. If it means they might even use coal in the interim, they're going to do it. And that's where I think the sort of the temporal challenge of this whole conversation gets so real. Because climate change is a big long-term problem. And we live in a world consumed with short-term crises. And that's so true for corporations. And I think that same tension explains a whole lot of the inaction that we see.
So let me probe that question about the data centers, because that's like on page 3. So we just bring it forward.
How many pages do we have?
Oh, I have about 6. We're going to be here about 5 hours, guys.
Yeah.
So everyone's talking about this demand issue, and the question is, how do we meet it? And there is perhaps a belief that the numbers could be overinflated, but we have to go with what we think is coming at us and get prepared. Every new energy has problems. Old energy have problems. The mix of meeting this challenge, given the time levels and supply chain issues for natural gas and other things, what do you see as the winning suite of technologies going forward, and how much of it would be behind the meter, as in on-site, versus on the grid?
Yeah. I think what you hear many people, including the Trump administration, talking about is everything approach, right? Like we need literally all forms of energy in a moment of growing energy demand. Now, in practice, what that means is, I mean, there is still coal being burned in this country. I think, from a climate perspective, it's in everyone's interest to transition that offline as quickly as possible. We've made enormous strides reducing the amount of coal consumption in this country over the last 10 years. I mean, the Bloomberg Philanthropies effort with the Sierra Club really made incredible headway shutting down coal plants. But you now see President Trump trying to revive the coal industry. Natural gas is, a linchpin of the electrical system right now, not going anywhere anytime soon. The United States is the world's largest exporter of natural gas, which a lot of people don't realize as well. We're also the world's largest producer of oil. We produce more crude than Saudi Arabia at this time. So, fossil fuels are the bedrock of the economy. They're really the industry that make all other industries possible. And so we can't be naive in thinking that this is going to disappear overnight. I think what the previous administration was trying to do is create a set of incentives that would be able to rapidly scale up alternatives. And so with things like the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, there were a set of federal incentives put in place that were designed to accelerate the manufacture, the production of things like solar panels and wind and batteries and electric vehicles. And it wasn't just those acts, there were other, new state-level mandates that certain utilities needed to start bringing more renewables onto the grid. And it's those kind of policy incentives that can start to bend that curve and sort of change the mix more or less rapidly. What we're seeing right now, though, with this administration is a real sort of return to the 20th century, if you will. They are in the process of or attempting to take away a lot of those incentives for renewable energies, and they are trying to make good on, what President Trump said he would do on the campaign trail, which is drill, baby, drill. And so they see the United States' dominance in fossil fuel, which is real, right, and is not going away anytime soon. They see it as not only the past, but also the future of America's energy supply. I think a lot of people would point out that this doesn't need to be an either-or conversation, that there's an opportunity for the United States to continue having a really profitable oil and gas business for many decades ahead, while also starting to build up its renewables business to compete with China, as you mentioned.
So let's delve into that, because China has talked about having a different kind of future, a different energy future that they are perceiving that would be built more on these clean energy sources.
Yeah.
And admittedly, part of this is for their own energy security, because they don't have the coal. I mean, they have the coal, but they don't have the natural gas and the oil that we have.
That's right.
Can you talk about, one of the things that they have been dubbed recently is the first electro-state. In other words, their geopolitical power coming from electricity and what they can create in their economy from these cleaner sources versus a petro-state. You guys can figure out. So how do you see, in many people's minds, there's two very different visions for the future. As you said, the US going back to what the old game plan. It appears that many in the world are trying to follow China, in part because they too want more energy security, not to be dependent on our fossil fuels, Russia's fossil fuels, or anybody's.
Yeah.
So as you see this game playing out, where do you see the rest of the world trying to get to? Which vision do you see them following?
Yeah. I think it's so important to just be nuanced and sort of embrace the messiness here, because it's not either or. And you look at the long-term projections, and the United States is still going to be exporting a lot of natural gas in 10 or 20 years. There's no reason to think that that's suddenly going to shut off. The renewables are not going to scale fast enough to make that be uneconomical, based on most current projections right now. It's also true that, as you said, China is absolutely dominating, not only on solar panels. They now are, responsible for something like 95% of solar components and panels around the world. They're dominating in electric vehicles as well, producing more in a month, basically, than the United States produces in a year. They're leapfrogging, as you said earlier, most of the technologies in batteries. They've made incredible strides recently. And now they're even starting to take the lead in things like nuclear There are 30 nuclear reactors under construction in China right now, which is more than in the rest of the world. And this is, again, an industry that the United States had historically dominated. And so you see China, doing much of this to meet its own internal energy demands, which is just tremendous and continues to grow at an astonishing rate. But they are also using it as a new form of soft power. So with things like the Belt and Road Initiative and their efforts to bring electricity to parts of sub-Saharan Africa, they've recognized that especially at a moment when the United States is retreating from some of its international engagements with the decimation of something like USAID, they have an opportunity to fill this vacuum. And one of the ways that they can do it is with exporting not just their phones and clothes and products, but with whole energy infrastructure plans that help countries that aren't fully on the grid get there. And a big way they're doing that is with renewables. All that said, super important to note, China is still the world's largest emitter of planet-warming gases and the largest consumer of coal. They're still building record numbers of coal plants. So again, we could talk about China as an electrostate, and it's also, in the same breath, have to acknowledge that they're also literally the world's biggest polluter right now.
Right. So I heard that they were going to make an announcement coming up pre-COP, this next COP. They were trying to come forward in a more leadership position. Have you heard any scuttlebutt?
Yeah, there's so COP, which is the United Nations Climate Change Conference. This year it's coming up. That always happens in November or so. This year it's going to be in Brazil. This is a year when many companies are expected to put forward ambitious new plans and targets for the timelines and how rapidly they're going to reduce their emissions. Yes, there is grumblings that China is going to come out with an ambitious target. Of course, this will happen in a year when the United States may not even participate in the climate conference. And yet, I mean, again, I don't mean to be waffly on too much of this stuff, but a target's a target. And we've seen, just as plans can change rapidly for a company like Microsoft, which put out an ambitious target and now is not adhering to it because facts on the ground changed. I think it's important to recognize that the same thing could be true with China. I think what they're doing is capitalizing on the momentum they have in renewables and trying to set an ambitious target. That's very different than meeting it.
But I will say one thing. Because of their incredible growth of EVs, their oil usage has begun to plateau and may have peaked. And that kind of drives global levels as well. And
it does.
We are looking at potentially peak oil in the next 4 or 5 years. And that's something I think was unbelievable 5 years ago. And that has been driven by China's using the market really to push through EVs. Right. They've taken a different approach.
And this is a moment where the economics can be a source of some optimism, because if we really, if peak oil happens, which is to say with sort of humanity is burning the most oil it's ever going to burn, and it's going to be a slow decline after that, it's not going away, that starts to change the economics of the oil business, starts to change the investment thesis for big oil companies, and it may lead to a situation where some oil is left in the ground. Right? And that, it's an abstract concept, but it's an important one, because scientists have calculated that if we were to literally burn every drop of oil and molecule of natural gas that's buried underground, well, the whole world would basically be like truly a greenhouse. It would be hot and humid just about everywhere. So we hope we don't get there. The way that we avoid that is by getting the economics of renewable energy to a place where it's simply not cost competitive to continue burning and drilling oil. And we're maybe at some of those inflection points.
And that is in many ways only because the true cost of carbon isn't captured in the price.
Yeah.
I think that's something that many people just don't think about when they see their electric bill or their gas bill, that in fact as taxpayers or as even consumers of food, they're paying for that out of another pocket. Yeah. And I think that's it's a hard concept for people to grasp, but it's such a critically important one because it costs so much.
Yeah. I don't want to get too wonky, but this concept of externalities is relevant to this kind of a conversation. And of course, so are federal subsidies. I mean, the fossil fuel industry continues to be enormously subsidized by many governments around the globe, whereas renewables get a fraction of those subsidies. So you imagine, well, what the government decides to support really matters. And that's why what's happening right now in this administration is so consequential.
So let's talk about that. Is it indeed, so what exactly has the Trump administration decided to do? How much is rhetoric? How much is action? And what do you think that consequence is going to be? How significant for the long term?
Yeah. The list is long of actions they've taken in the first 100 days or so. Exactly what is real and what is not is still being hashed out in the courts in some levels. But I think what we can see broadly is that, as mentioned, there is a serious effort to roll back or repeal key parts of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. These laws that tried to provide support for the growth of the renewable industry in the United States. And you can already see, even just with the uncertainty about the degree to which some of the things like these tax credits, again, sorry to get wonky, but right, this is what actually matters. There were tax credits embedded in some of these laws that businesses were counting on. The uncertainty around whether those tax credits are actually going to stick around has caused literally $12 billion worth of renewable energy projects to either be canceled or put on hold just in the last 3 months. So you can already see that sort of grinding to a halt of this momentum that there was in the renewable industry. We've also seen, to paint in pretty broad brushes, an effort to fast-track approvals for new fossil fuel permits for things like pipelines and natural gas export terminals, and a simultaneous effort to slow or even pause indefinitely approvals for new renewable energy projects such as offshore wind. And so these are, big policy levers that the White House controls that, again, are just trying to sort of tamp the brakes, if you will, on the renewable business and pump the gas, if you will, on the fossil fuel business. That's the broad economic strokes. Then there's the regulatory environment, and we've seen, the Environmental Protection Agency, which was set up under President Nixon with the express mandate of sort of keeping Americans healthy and the nation's public spaces and air and water clean and free of pollutants. Lee Zeldin, former congressman from Long Island, has sort of unilaterally reframed the mission of the EPA to now be about promoting economic development in the United States, which is sort of a head-spinning reinterpretation of the mandate of the Environmental Protection Agency. But that's what we're seeing. And that's going to have cascading downstream effects as the EPA starts to reevaluate or cancel tailpipe emissions regulations, smokestack emissions regulations. All of this is either in the works or announced. And so what we're going to see, many analysts believe, is in the totality, a really sharp increase in fossil fuel emissions compared to what we would have seen under the Biden administration. Important to note, we may still see during this Trump administration an overall decline in emissions because some of this transition, some of this energy transition does sort of have a momentum of its own. And as we discussed, as more EVs come on the road, emissions are going to fall. As more utilities get solar and wind on the grid, maybe that means less coal, less natural gas. Efficiency is improving in a lot of ways. That's going to help. So broad trend line, emissions in the US are still falling. But I think what's clear is they won't fall nearly as fast as they would have under a different administration.
Are you seeing pockets across the aisle and trying to maintain some of these things, especially tax credits that have brought so many jobs and economic development to Georgia and South Carolina? 75%, I believe, of the benefit of some of these policies were in conservative voting areas.
That's right.
Are we seeing a pushback? these are jobs, these are
jobs, these are big investments, and,
Yeah.
and the answer is absolutely yes, and it's bipartisan. I've written several articles just in the last couple months about a group of Republican representatives. There's a contingent in the Senate as well that is trying to lobby the White House economic team to preserve some of these tax credits. Again, sorry to put people to sleep about talking about tax credits, but these are the actual levers that determine how quickly or slowly a country like the United States actually makes this energy transition. And yeah, we see Republican congressman, led in this case by Representative Andrew Garbarino, also out of Long Island. He's trying to say, this makes good economic sense. We don't have to talk about it in terms of climate change. It's not the Green New Deal, but it is great manufacturing jobs, and these are important tax credits that were benefiting the economy writ large. Forget what the end goal was. Truth is, we don't know how the administration is responding yet. We're moving toward reconciliation. There will be probably a broader tax bill that comes out later this year, and we'll have to see, to what extent some of these representatives are really willing to go to the mat when it comes time to.
Well, one other thing I want to follow up about is we were talking about that increase in demand. What I have heard is that so many of the options are being slowed down by supply chain issues, especially natural gas. So if we need this new demand tomorrow, isn't it renewables that are most likely poised to be able to get online quickly enough to meet the demand?
Yeah, absolutely. You can build a small solar plant faster than you can build a medium-sized natural gas plant. But the truth is there's still reliability issues. There's still land use issues, right? A big solar plant that's going to compete with a major natural gas plant requires a huge amount of land. There's permitting issues. And so I think a lot of people wish it was that simple, right? That, you can just put wind and solar in place of a natural gas plant. But it's just not. There are still intermittency issues, and you said it, right? Texas hit that amazing milestone on an extremely windy day.
It's a windy day, yeah.
It's not always windy, and the sun's not always out. And I don't say that as to be an apologist for the fossil fuel industry, but the truth is, right now, the mix just isn't fully there to support. I mean, look at the lights around us. Look at the AV. We use a lot of energy. And no one's quite willing to say, we're willing to go back to the Stone Age and live in a world where some of this electricity is not as readily accessible. People are still expecting, their full standard of living, and that, at least for now, has created a situation where grid operators believe that they need a whole bunch of natural gas.
Right. No, and obviously natural gas isn't going anywhere. If anything, it might even go higher. But I guess the thing that's surprising me a little bit is my sense of it was that non-fossil fuels had been responsible for all of the electricity growth, all of the additional, 96% last year.
Absolutely.
And internationally, like 91%.
Yeah.
So they were picking up a lot of that load growth, but now all of a sudden we have that hockey stick, and it's changing the equation.
That's right.
And we need to either keep coal online for a little bit longer or bring in natural gas.
Yeah.
Problem with natural gas is methane, and the fact that it is flaring that in throughout its system from production through transport. We have ways to ameliorate that, but the administration just kind of rolled back. That is their number one first thing that they did.
Yep.
But since we're talking in the abstract, let's recognize another milestone. We've talked a little about economic ones, and that is that this year, or last year, we reached the 1.5 degree increase. Now, that doesn't mean we cross the barrier, because we have to hit it for quite a few years before we officially cross our stretch goal that was decided at Paris that was supposed to keep us at safe levels. There's a lot of talk about once we hit 1.5, the reactions within the climate get much worse, and we start feeling them at an accelerated rate. We're kind of on a 3.1C trajectory right now. So as we talk about what's possible over here in the energy, let's talk about what's possible for our future as far as the livability of much of the planet.
Yeah.
What is a 3.1 degree C world like? Can you kind of help us visualize what that would be?
I try not to think about it too much. I mean, it's catastrophic, honestly. I mean, many coastal cities are underwater without extensive seawalls. average global temperatures are extremely higher. That's going to make places like India, which is, even right now in parts of the Middle East, experiencing unprecedented heat waves, potentially unlivable. Parts are just going to be too hot too often to sustain comfortable human life outdoors. We don't know. Again, I try to be honest about what we don't know. We can anticipate there will be large-scale disruptions to agriculture, but we don't know exactly what they're going to look like. But what we even saw in 2 summers ago, which was an extremely hot one here in the United States, a lot of airplanes couldn't land because the runways were too soft. And so you start to think about just a couple extra degrees on an ongoing basis starts to quite literally liquefy some of our infrastructure. And again, to get back to that earlier conversation we were having about cost, right? What's the cost of having to come up with a new pavement that can sustain 130-degree heats and then repaving every runway in the country? Well, there's a $1 trillion job right there. So it's treacherous. Now, I agree, right? The models, whether you look at the projections coming out of the IPCC or which is a UN body that looks closely at climate science, or even Morgan Stanley. There was this report that sort of went viral a couple weeks ago on air conditioning, where they said very sort of offhandedly, well, we're planning for a 3-degree world. The consensus is that yes, we are headed there. I try not to be Pollyannish, and I'm not a techno-optimist, but I also don't underestimate humanity's ability to adapt. And that isn't to say that there isn't going to be a tremendous amount of suffering, and that the suffering will be wildly unequally distributed. And we're all, very fortunate to live the lives we do, and I think we should all remember that every day. For a Bangladeshi rice farmer or a Vietnamese fisherman, the consequences are going to be much more immediate and severe. Nevertheless, I really do believe that the amount of energy and innovation that's happening right now is going to change the conversation in some really fundamental ways that we can't currently predict. And whether that's fusion, or whether that's different types of carbon capture or geoengineering, we're in this sort of extraordinary moment where the scale of the problem has gotten so big and people are grasping the potential severity of it, and that's making people get that much more ambitious with their ideas of how we might respond. So again, I'm not Pollyannish. I'm not suggesting that we've got the solutions at hand that are going to prevent us from getting to a 3-degree world, or that the journey along the way isn't going to be really, really rough for a whole lot of people and ecosystems. But I also am not fatalistic.
Was that an optimist way of ending? I'm not sure.
That's optimistic for a journalist.
Okay. So we have about 15 more minutes for the audience to ask questions. So we have a question in the back.
You mentioned carbon capture. What I heard both of you say before that was hydrocarbons are going to be around for a long time. You're hopeful that you can replace them with replaceable energy, et cetera. But it would seem to me that carbon capture has got to be a major part of the future solution, particularly if you're going to keep the temperature growth low enough for us all humans to survive. And I wonder if the two of you could give us a little bit of your thoughts about the current research that's going on in that area and where things stand.
Yeah.
That's you.
That's me. Okay. I'll take this one in part because I wrote a ton about it last year. We did a big series called Buying Time, which looked at carbon capture solutions as well as other geoengineering technologies, sort of precisely on this point of how are we going to address some of these massive challenges we've got. The answer is carbon capture works, but it's expensive, and it works in incredibly small quantities right now relative to the amount of carbon dioxide we're pumping into the atmosphere. And so what we're seeing right now is a big growth industry as many different companies find lots of different ways to sequester carbon dioxide in a durable way. So some of that is things like direct air capture, where there's these big fans blowing air over certain chemical solutions that grab the carbon dioxide, then turn it into a gas, and they can pump it underground. That's one way to do it. There are other processes that use more biological matter that can sort of, again, sequester carbon, and they wrap up this very sort of, put carbon dioxide in a sponge, wrap it up in foil, bury it in bricks. And then there's things like point source capture, which is to say at the very moment that you're burning natural gas or oil, you capture the carbon dioxide even before it goes into the atmosphere. You grab that, you put it underground. All of those, again, they work right now, but it's incredibly expensive, and relative to the amount of carbon dioxide we're putting into the air, relative to the amount of emissions, it's just infinitesimal. And so, yes, I think in the best case scenario, what a lot of people say is, fast forward 50 years, maybe more like 70 or even 100 years, humanity, as far as we can tell, may still need to be burning certain fossil fuels for certain processes, things like long duration shipping, things like long haul air flights, right? Big, complex industrial processes, the use of petrochemicals. There are a lot of ways that right now we don't actually have an easy way to swap out the burning of fossil fuels. And for those processes, the hope is maybe by that point, carbon dioxide capture will have scaled well enough to capture most of that, so we can sort of achieve this net zero equilibrium. But no one I've talked to has any illusions that given the current state of emissions, carbon capture can make a real dent in addressing what we're currently doing.
So isn't it true, though, that there's a lot of belief, I guess this is what you were saying, that we are going to need it so much in the second part of the century, that the type of research and investment today is warranted, even though it might take money away from something else, but because in the long term, we really need it.
That's certainly the argument that a lot of people in that industry will make. It's not my job to say what's warranted or not, but it is very clear that there's an investment thesis that is allowing many, big corporates, big banks to get behind some of these technology and invest in them with the belief that there is a big market in the future.
And oil and gas is also very interested in it because
Absolutely.
of what you said.
Absolutely.
Which is intriguing to me because there are some of these newer technologies like the land-based ones that actually do quite well, but they aren't getting the same kind of investment.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, right there.
David, would you talk a little bit more in detail about carbon capture, about using the ocean and forests, and how that would work and how effective that would be specifically?
Yeah, so that's sort of another bucket of carbon capture is using nature-based solutions is broadly one way to refer to them, which is to say like planting trees, right? You plant the right kind of trees in the right places, they can sequester a lot of carbon. Sure, that will help, but it's going to be a similar answer, right? At this moment, at this scale, or ocean iron fertilization you just referred to, that's the technical term for sort of putting certain types of iron molecules into the ocean in the hopes that they actually create a reaction that draws more carbon into the ocean. Similar situation, though. It is so dwarfed by our current emissions that in the immediate, it's not going to have a meaningful effect at the scale that they're currently doing that work compared to the amount of emissions that are still going into the atmosphere.
Was there a question, Dallas?
I think you said you were not a techno-optimist.
I think I said that.
The zeitgeist could change if some disaster happened. And we didn't talk about tipping points today, but there's been a lot written about the Atlantic currents or the thawing of the Arctic, and there are a lot of others. There must be 6 or 8 or 10 others that I've read about. Do any of these enter into your thinking, and do you think that any of those, should they actually begin to unfold in a 2 or 3 degree centigrade, more hot, warmer world, if they unfolded, would they change things? Would they change the zeitgeist and change how we behave? How do you think about these?
Yeah, I mean, the tipping points that you're referring to are, again, these sort of theoretical at this point thresholds within the natural world that once hit are basically irreversible. And just to put a little more meat on the bone here, you talked about sort of the Atlantic current. So there is concern that as the Atlantic Ocean, the northern Atlantic, gets warmer, it could disrupt this very powerful current that brings warm air and water up from the equatorial region toward northern Europe, right? If you look at a map, right, London's pretty far up there, but it can be very pleasant because of that current. You take away that current, and suddenly a lot of northern Europe, a lot of Europe, becomes a pretty incredibly cold place. Another one you mentioned, some of the melting in the Arctic, same sort of thing, right? If the melting, which has happened at a serious but relatively predictable rate, were to suddenly increase, sure, that could have radical effects on global sea levels in a matter not of decades or centuries, but of years. These are enormous concerns, of course. I'm not one to predict exactly how the global economy or policy makers would respond in the event that we hit them, but people are trying to figure this out. And even within our own government, there have been extensive work by the Department of Defense, by State Department, to start to game out some of these things under the previous administrations. So I think it shows that at the highest levels of power, many people are taking these issues seriously. And I think we should all hope for all of our sakes that we don't actually get there. Yeah.
So you mentioned about the data centers and the need for serious power. And my understanding is that the electric grid is not up to the requirements needed for these huge data centers. Can you talk a little bit about where that stands?
Yeah, it's not just the data centers that the grid isn't up to the task for. I mean, our grid is just wildly antiquated and inefficient in this country. Many projections suggest that we need to build, I forget, it's like, I'm just going to blank on the number, but it's basically we need to build 3 times as many high transmission lines as we currently have to meet the new generation of electricity demand, especially in a world where we're employing more renewables, and we're just not even close. And here, we get into the conversation around permitting reform and NIMBYism, and the fact that Americans really don't like it when things are being built in their backyards. And that's true in nice neighborhoods like this, and it's true in rural areas where I've been out reporting on these very projects, on water pipelines, on electric grids. I've been to these communities where, for us, they seem like, it's in a remote part of Maine or a rural rancher area of Colorado. That's the perfect place to put a high-speed transmission line. But you tell that to the guy that's been there for 40 years, and it's the exact wrong place. And that's a major roadblock. And my colleague Ezra Klein and his colleague Derek Tompkins just put out this book, Abundance, a couple weeks ago. And this is one of their central theses, which is that we can do a lot of the things that we're all saying are necessary to get to a more efficient, sustainable kind of economy. But they're going to require some trade-offs. And this, what you just identified, permitting reform, radical overhauls to the grid, that's a big part of it.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a minute about reconductoring, though, and some of the things that they were talking about, the new technologies to provide more energy on the grid we have?
Yeah, you know more about that than I do, Kathleen. I don't know about reconductoring. I got to call you and get sourced up for a story.
See me afterwards if anyone wants to talk about that. Let's keep it at the question.
Kathleen? Hi. Here. Going back to the chat you had earlier about the messaging, the conversation with the community making them more aware of the issues. Clearly, in the last year's election cycle, the messaging didn't resonate while people were worrying about the price of eggs at the grocery store. So, many of your colleagues are writing now at the New York Times about what we need to do to create a more populist agenda, civic uprising, as your colleague David Brooks just recently talked about. So my question for both of you is, how do we make the conversation around climate change, around the environment, around sustainability, around energy transition more personal and more of a populist agenda?
You take that one, Kathleen.
Okay. Well, I think that's exactly what we are trying to do, though maybe not the populist part, but making it more universal. And I think the way you do it is by tying it, helping people understand what is happening, what the actual risk could be ahead, and what they could lose. Because again, I don't think, everyone kind of goes, oh, climate change is going to get hotter, oh, climate change, that's bad, or it's not that good. Very few people actually understand what it means, and what it means for their insurance, what it means for their food, what does it mean for their ability to be outside and play a sport that they love during the summer. They don't understand what they're being asked to give up. And the Secretary of Energy point blank said that climate change is real, but it's just a trade-off we have to have, something that we just have to accept in order to have a modern world. But he never delineates what that means for our pocketbooks, for our quality of life, or for our financial stability. So I think that's one of the things that we try to do so hard, is to hit those universal things of importance to every American and make the line between the dots that climate change is going to hurt all of those things. I do think that the politicization of the issue has harmed us in ways that we would never have envisioned. This became the #1 thing that divided us, more than abortion, immigration. For many years, it was the #1, which is kind of crazy because it's a scientific issue that is measured up the gazoo. But it is literally a lightning rod of emotion. And so talking about it instead of climate change head on, but instead economic development or transitioning to a cleaner future environment, or that using some of those soft buzzwords can help because they're universal. And I have to say, when I'm in the Deep South and I'm in South Carolina, they love their land. They want to keep it pure. They want to protect it. They want good jobs, but they don't want to destroy their children's lives in order to get it. So if you lay it out in a way they can understand, they do come around. But it's piece by piece, and I don't know how to do it in a big way. What we need is a really good TV show that will rally the world in the future using art to help us get there. Next, is there another question?
One more question.
Okay.
Just to come full circle, Chouinard and Patagonia 40 years ago was at the vanguard of recycling materials that you bought from them and so forth. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about where their thinking is in terms of going forward and in regard to all these issues.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming back to it. And I think it's a great place to end in a way, because Yvon himself, and I spent a lot of time with him over the last couple of years, he's a real curmudgeon. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And it's not just his old age. His nature is he's sort of a pessimist. And he looks at the natural world, which, as I said, he loves so much. And he looks at what humanity's done to it. And he has this real sense of resentment. And you could imagine that kind of a posture would lead him to be a little disenchanted and disengaged. But it's the exact opposite. He's more fired up than ever about trying to protect the natural world we have, about funding people on the front lines who are doing this kind of work, about real environmental activism that is grounded not just in protest, but in policy and in policy advocacy and in legal action, where necessary. And so he's, again, not Pollyannish. He doesn't believe that everything's going to be okay magically, but he recognizes that he has the opportunity, he has the platform, he has the resources to try to move the needle on some of these issues, and he literally gave everything he had to try to do it. And that's just, I think, a remarkable story that we can all learn from, even if we don't have our own $6 billion company to give away.
Yay.